This is London calling. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
Stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands.
Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
We were marching through, we were chasing the Germans. It was getting close to the end of the war. A sergeant come up and told us all, check your gas mask. We are going into a town that they think has a gas dump that's mined. So when we proceeded to this town, it was Dachau. And part of our division, the 222nd Regiment, had troops in the camp, liberating the camp. And the time that we come to the gate of the camp, they open the compounds, and I seen thousands of people crowding out that looked like skeletons with skin stretched on them. They were dirty, they smelled, and just one look at them, some of them half dead, that something happened that we realized that this war is all about. We know now why we were participating in this war.
These are Russians, Poles, Hungarians, Belgians, French, Norwegians, Czech, English. have been interned here temporarily. About half of these people are Jews. Legally, meaning Nazi legal, these people are political prisoners. Here is a 3-year-old political prisoner.
Most of the things I saw were so horrible that they've been blocked mentally, I guess from self-preservation or something, that I don't remember the details very much. I remember a couple of scenes very vivid. One, when we were approaching, we saw a trainload of prisoners. Turned out they were not prisoners. It was a trainload of bodies. They had been sent to Dachau from Buchenwald. I presume to go through the furnaces of ovens of Dachau. That's a presumption. The other scene was in the campgrounds. I saw 2 of these living, walking skeletons shuffling along toward each other. They got within a few yards of each other, stopped, stared at each other, and then they tried to run and embraced.
They opened all the gates, and we started on all 4 because they let us know that the soldiers are coming. And we went out to greet the American soldiers. And we dropped to their feet and we kissed their boots.
And you saw women on the floor, on wooden pallets. When I say women, you saw skeletons. Rags hanging on them, no shoes. Bones instead of faces. And the stench was so horrible. It's hard to describe.
The year 1945. The war has been going on for 6 years. Hitler is now dead and the end is in sight. It must have felt like apocryphal. A massive change was coming, but also, of course, there would have been an element of excitement and desperation. I mean, let's face it, even though all this is going on, you've still got to get up in the morning, you've still got to get clean clothes, you've still got to put your dinner on the table, what you can find. So these things, although when we tend to focus on history, we obviously look at the massive great things that are happening. We tend to forget that living life for all of us is the everyday, going to bed, surviving, and this would have had to happen as well.
Finally, almost the whole world was combined against the evildoers, who are now prostrate before us.
There would have been a massive displacement of locality, of geography, of where people physically were and not being in their homeland, but also a displacement of societal structure. So the way they define themselves has gone, and they need to redefine who they are and what they are in society. That's a big step for everybody.
the Russians were coming close by. And so we all walked out, and we started walking. We walked for days. I'll never forget it. I don't know how many days we walked. We walked, and then we took cattle cars, and then we walked again. And as we walked, we heard gunshots, and they told us to keep on marching. We heard gunshots, and they were shooting people in the back who couldn't keep up with the walking. It ended up being called the Dead March, because the ravines and the gutters, they were all red from blood. From people, some people who spoke Polish, we were walking through Poland. And some people who thought they could escape would try and escape. Some people who couldn't keep up with their walking anymore, they got weak, they threw all their bundles away and they walked until they couldn't keep up anymore. They fell behind and the Germans just shot them. We saw people being shot in the front, in their chest, in the back. They were laying all over on top of hills, behind trees. It was really like a war zone.
As the camps were about to be liberated, the Germans tried to move the inmates out, those who were still able to walk or to work. They left those behind to be killed, to die, who was too sick. But they marched them out. And they were marching, I think it was from Flossenburg to march to Dachau, or one of the camps. And they took them through the woods, and they marched at night. And if anybody faltered on the way, they were immediately shot. If anybody paused to try to pick up a potato or to eat a root or something, they were shot. And I was able to follow this trail through the woods of mass graves, 10, 20, 30, 50 killed, you know, and I would get the nearest farmer to say, dig them up. They would say, oh yes, we heard firing there last night. There was shooting going on. Where was it? Over there in the woods. And I would say, let's go. And we'd go out to the woods, and there would be a newly dug up place, and I'd say, get some shovels. And I'd stop some Germans on the street, take the shovels, dig them up. And we'd dig up the bodies of people who'd been obviously shot through the head. Usually the top of the skull was blown off, shot probably kneeling from the back. Some of them were tied still, you know, just lightly covered over with, you know, 6 inches of dirt, something like that. So I could follow the trail of crime being committed all along the way.
As the Allied forces drew closer, those who had aligned themselves with the Nazi Party realised the writing was on the wall. There was no way out for them. They were facing war crimes and imprisonment, and many of them felt that the only option left available to them was suicide. Geographically, Devon was a very vulnerable city. There was loads of rivers, there was loads of waterways. They felt there was no way out, they were trapped. And so many of them committed suicide. In fact, 1,000 residents committed suicide in 72 hours. Unfortunately, this became a bit of a common occurrence throughout May 1945. As the Allied forces approached, senior Nazi officials and officers took the cyanide pills they'd kept for such purposes.
and there was this gigantic ship, which turned out to be the Cap Arcona. That was a Hamburg South America liner, 37,000 tons luxury ship. I was in a cabin that had 3 bunks, and I think we had 12 or 14 people in that little cabin. And of course, again, very little to eat. And again, we didn't know what happens. The rumors, you know. By then, most of the guards were old German soldiers who got drafted at the last minute. The rumors through these older German guards was that there is no coal on the ship. So if there is no coal on the ship, why did they put us on that ship? So all kinds of rumors, right and left, until May 3rd came around. And at 2 o'clock, a little after 2, we heard bombs falling on the ship. And the ship started to burn. And there was an open door, and you could see the sea. So I jumped just like most of the others who happened to be able to get to that door. And I was in the water, and the ship was burning. We were trying to get away. Anyway, somebody got this little ship and started to get it away from the burning Cap Arcona. And I was one of the lucky ones who got on this little ship. Some people couldn't make it, and we tied up this boat, and we were naked and running, and no shoes and no nothing. Hardly any, you know, maybe some kind of a shirt, but not even shirt. We didn't have shirts. We had the concentration camp garb, which was the blue and white marking and the numbers, and so whoever had that on yet. So we got on ground, firm ground. I don't know who. I was one of them. I don't know who the others were. All prisoners from the 9-gun camp. And the British tanks were coming down. And one of the first tanks stopped and pulled down the flag, the German Hakenkreuz. They pulled down the flag, and here were these people coming out of the water, and of course this was the first troops of the British. They had no idea what was going on. Who were these people? I spoke a little English, and there were other people, so we made it clear to them what happened, but we didn't know what bombed the ship. So until much later, until we found out it was the British who bombed the ships, and there was not just our ship, there were 3 ships in the Lubeck Bay, and they were all bombed, and there were about 8,000 people who were killed. They did not know it for 40 years who they were bombing on May 3rd, 1945.
In the last month of battle in the European theatre, thousands of Nazi troops began to surrender, some voluntarily, some by force. And after that, they really had their eyes opened up to the atrocities that had been committed by the Nazi regime. Hundreds of German citizens and troops were paraded through the liberated camps, such as Dachau, and they saw with their own eyes the thousands of bodies, the lifeless bodies of the men, women, children who had suffered unimaginable terrors at the hands of the Nazis. They finally learned what had really been happening.
We were determined that the people of Weimar see the sample of their culture, and we marched 3,000 of them to the camp. They saw.
If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science.
During this time, thousands of German prisoners of war were sent to displaced persons camps, and they were face to face with people from the forced labour camps and the concentration camps as well. And it was situations where guards were literally sharing space with people they had been torturing. Arrangements were made for prisoners of war to be transferred to the UK and the United States, where they were watered, clothed, fed, and looked after generally by charities such as the Red Cross. It took a few years for them to return to their homelands, but some never did. Some stayed and made new lives in the countries they had been interned in. Sachsenhausen was a camp erected to the north of Berlin in 1936, and originally it was meant to house political opponents and criminals, but it ended up housing Jewish prisoners instead. So by the end of 1936 you had more than 1,600 Jewish prisoners in there, and by the end of 1938 that had risen to 6,000. And by the time you get to the beginning of 1945, you would have found over 11,000 Jewish prisoners in that camp. Sachsenhausen grew steadily during World War II, and they had to add sub-camps on in order to take more prisoners. There weren't only German prisoners there though. There were many prisoners who just didn't fit the Nazi ideals of age or race or denomination. You had Jehovah's Witnesses, you had gypsies. It's estimated that approximately 200,000 people were in prison there, but we've only got records for about 140,000 of them, and unfortunately 30,000 of those people died in that camp.
The hundred of people lying on the bed made with wood. These people couldn't even move their head. Hands, legs look like skeleton. But they cried with joy when they saw us soldiers. And I remember some mistakes, our mistakes. Our soldiers, my colleagues, with human instinct, they want to help to these people. And they share with their food portion.
Yes.
And I tell you frankly, I was a young man and I don't know that that is dangerous for their life. Of course, Soon our doctor rushed in and explained to my soldiers they should stop this way, help them, that should be under doctor's supervision. They should even slowly, gradually. Liberation of Sachsenhausen, this concentration camp, dozens Polish soldiers were killed. In my company, among my soldiers, Polish citizens, 2 of them I remember Jewish nationality, Polish soldiers, they died during the battle. Which my friends, we are together.
Went through Luxembourg and Belgium, France, Germany, into Czechoslovakia, a short distance and back out, and into Austria, and that's when we wound up with Mauthausen. The agreement was made at Yalta between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, where they divided Europe. We sent a patrol out in an effort to keep in contact with the enemy or to contact the Russians. And since we couldn't go any further than the restraining line, which was approximately a mile or so on the other side of Mauthausen, that's how we found it, because we were probing, and that's about the best I can say, is that in our attempt to keep contact with the enemy or contact the Russians, here was Mauthausen.
What happened?
And the patrol leader called in by radio and said that we have come across something and we're not sure what it is. It's a big prison of some kind, and there are people running all over. I said, well, is there any combat or shooting of any kind? He said, no. I said, well, you return, bring the patrol and come back. And they reported into the headquarters and told me roughly what it was. And so I reinforced the patrol and I went back to Mauthausen. And that is when I made a complete inspection and came back and reported into General Dager, our division commander, and told him what it was. And it was shortly after that report that he said to me on the telephone, he said, Dick, he said, you will return to Mauthausen and take command. It's a lot of people, a lot of bodies, and a lot of people running around. There was no control of any kind. These people were strictly on their own, and no one knew what was going on or what the situation was, really and truly. They were like lost sheep. Well, first of all of these dead bodies piled up like cordwood, if you will. Sick people, dying people, starved people. And you take to an American such a sight as that, you can't imagine it. Things like that don't happen, but they did. And so we were actually and truly, the people that were with me, they were all dumbfounded. See, the SS, when they left, they disrupted the power plant. We had no lights, no power, no water, no sewage, no sanitation of any kind, and that is exactly what we found, and we had to get that cleared up fast because of the health of the prisoners of the camp. Not only that, but my own people. 18,000 in the camp at that time. We gathered up about 700 bodies, which we had to bury. We had no identification of any kind, and we buried them in the old sports flats, which was the recreational area for the SS. My people and I left. There was only about 3,000 to 3,500 people left. And the bulk of those people didn't want to go home. And there were quite a number of Jewish people left in the camp that did not wish to return to their homelands. In checking with these people, the older Jew wanted to go to Israel. The younger Jews wanted to go to the United States, to England, or to France. I did not recognize a Jew as a Jew. He was a human being just like anybody else.
Thousands and thousands of people turned up in Dam Square in Amsterdam to celebrate because the country was free. But unfortunately, just after 3 p.m, rogue Kriegsmarine troops started shooting into the crowd indiscriminately. Some say that the German troops surrendered, whereas others say there was a bit of a standoff and they were eventually trapped and arrested by Canadian forces inside a club where they'd been hiding. But unfortunately, 30 people died that day, 120 were injured, and nobody was ever brought to justice for this crime.
In the final stages, I was with the 5th U.S. Infantry Division, which was part of Patton's Third Army, and we had gone through Germany and were now approaching Czechoslovakia. The town immediately ahead of us was Volary. We had actually been bogged down in the mud because it rained for almost a week, and we couldn't advance. But we were now trying to make our final push to link up with the Russians, and reports reached us that the town of Volary, in that area known as the Sudetenland, which is the border area between Germany and Czechoslovakia, in which at that time the Sudeten German, mostly populated by Sudeten Germans. At any rate, that town was flying white flags from the rooftops, and so we knew they were ready to surrender. And because of my particular assignment that I had throughout the war, and because I was German speaking, I was sent in together with a small military government unit and one jeep of medics. There were 3 jeeps who went into Volary to do their various, to perform their various tasks. The military government unit had to negotiate with the mayor about the surrender, and it was my assignment to search for any remaining German troops. I did find a few wounded in a German field hospital and made arrangements for their evacuation. But because it was getting dark, this was late in the day, we felt we had to get back to our lines, and the war was not over yet either at that point. So once we returned to our lines, we compared notes of what we had done, and I learned from the military government unit that they had heard of a group of Polish and Hungarian Jewish women who had been dumped by their SS guards in a vacant factory building, and who had been liberated by our troops. So we knew, of course, that we had to do something for them, even though we couldn't do anything that day anymore. And in the morning, we set out, greatly reinforced, to take care of the matter. And I had heard where that factory building was, and I remember approaching it and getting out of the Jeep and walking across a courtyard where I saw some skeletal figures trying to get some water from a hand pump. But over on the other side, leaning next to against the wall, next to the entrance of the building, I saw a girl standing, and I decided to walk up to her, and I asked her in German and in English whether she spoke either language, and she answered me in German. And I asked about her companions, and she said, "Come, let me show you." And we went inside the factory. It was an indescribable scene. There were women scattered over the floor on scraps of straw, some of them quite obviously with a mark of death on their faces. All of them looked just horrible, and of course we could see they were emaciated and ill. And something that I have never been able to forget was an extraordinary thing that happened. The girl who was my guide made sort of a sweeping gesture over this scene of devastation and said the following words: "Noble be man, merciful and good." And I could hardly believe that she was able to summon a poem by the German poet Goethe, which is called The Divine, at such a moment. And there was nothing that she could have said that would have underscored the grim irony of the situation better than what she did. And it was a totally shattering experience for me.
Portugal especially maintained a neutral stance. Their Prime Minister Salazar, he was in power from 1936 until 1968. And when I say he was in power, he was really in power. He was in total control. He had no opposition, he had a very strong military, he was totally in charge. Despite his very fascist leanings, he stayed true to the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of Windsor. And after the war was over, in May 1945, the Prime Minister came out and said he was really, really glad the war was over, that there'd be no more suffering and no more deaths.
First of all, stopping the fighting and ending the horrors that war brings with it is already a priceless achievement. The liberation of countries that have been tested so hard in their worthy struggle, the recovery of their independence and their freedoms, being able to work for the people's well-being and not their annihilation, these things bring with them the cherished sensation of breaking bonds, of waking up from nightmares and of the promise of happiness which being reborn to life brings with it. While the future is still overshadowed by great concerns and the business of material and moral reconstruction proves more challenging than the business of war, we will see that these are tasks to be carried out in peace and in hope. This in itself is enough to raise spirits, lighten hearts, and ease the common effort. Peace and blessings.
Will now pronounce the sentences on the defendants convicted on this indictment. Defendant Karl Dönitz, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to 10 years imprisonment. Defendant Rudolf Hess, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to imprisonment for life. Defendant Alfred Rosenberg, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Defendant Wilhelm Frick, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Defendant Hermann Wilhelm Göring, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Defendant Alfred Jodl, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied Expeditionary Force. Advance, Britannia! Long live the cause of freedom! God save the King!
He was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was the top man at his craft. But then his number came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a-blowin' reveille. He's the boogie-woogie bugle boy of Company B.
Thousands upon thousands of people gathered to share this historic day with the King and Queen. The entire space, the whole roadway, the whole pavement, and the whole scene is one dense mass of people. People in the gayest colors, red, white, and blue rosettes, red, white, and blue hats, streamers, flags. There are still signs of the long years we've gone through. Right opposite me still I see a yellow trench shelter sign, and also the broken columns of the palace where the bomb hit during the Blitz. One reminder to us of how much their majesties shared the life of their people during this civilian war.